Thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. We are going to go ahead and kick it off. So welcome to our webinar on privilege escalation, how attackers level up. Before we jump into it, we're going to start by letting you know that this will be recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be made available afterwards if you want to go back through and pick up on some extra things that you might have missed the first time around. So this will be recorded, it will be available, and we're very excited to get started. My name is Julie Brown. I'm a security engineer at Red Canary, and I've been there for about 2 years. And now the rest of our panel is going to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Cathy Kramer, and I'm a detection engineer at Red Canary.
I'm Erika Nordberg. I'm a senior threat researcher at VMware Carbon Black, mostly doing malware analysis and reverse engineering.
And I'm Sarah Yoder, a cybersecurity engineer at MITRE and one of the core members of the attack team.
So Sarah's going to kick us off with an introduction of privilege escalation.
Great, so today we're going to be diving into privilege escalation. So in short, this is when an adversary is going to try to gain higher level permissions than they start with. So compared to a normal user, a system or root level user can often be used to leverage additional adversary goals, something like maybe credential dumping or lateral movement.
So today we're going to talk about 3 things. How do adversaries use privilege escalation? And what does that look like on different operating systems? So we'll be looking at Windows, macOS, and Linux. And for each operating system, look at how do adversaries use privilege escalation in the wild? How can you detect it on each of those operating systems? So we'll go a little bit into what sort of data to collect, and then how to detect privilege escalation per operating system. And then finally, why does it matter? And why is privilege escalation something that we should care about in our environments? So we're going to start today with Windows. And Sarah's going to tell us everything we need to know.
I don't know about everything, but I can tell you
maybe part of it.
I can tell you about 2 common privilege escalation techniques that we see on the Windows side. So the first is access token manipulation. So just a little background. Access tokens are kernel objects that define the security context of a process. So when a process wants to act, it uses a token which is tied to a logon session and determines how the credential is used. So basically, it's kind of like an ID card that most of us probably use at work. So if you have the right token or like kind of your badge at work, you can access specific buildings or doors. And that's kind of how tokens and processes work together. So in the case of access token manipulation, kind of adversaries' main goal is to trick the system into believing that the running process belongs to someone other than themselves. So kind of stealing somebody else's work badge to get into a building you can't. So one common way that they can do this, like specifically, a common one is Metasploit's get system interpreter script, which will go through a number of different techniques to attempt to gain a system level privilege on a remote system. So then the other technique that we're going to kind of dive into is bypass user access control, or UAC. So UAC is a Windows feature that prevents harmful programs from making changes to a user's computer by prompting the user for confirmation. Often we've seen that little box like, hey, are you sure you want this thing to run? That's the user access control. And the idea behind this feature is that even if you're an admin on a system, that doesn't mean that any program should kind of inherit those privileges and be able to run whatever it wants. However, there's kind of a design flaw with this in that it can be easily bypassed. There are several ways to perform this technique, ranging from DLL hijacking to elevated COM objects and so on. In fact, UAC.me is a open source repository that people are constantly adding more and more techniques to. And Cathy's actually going to show us some of these examples later on. But for now, let's talk about kind of some things of like what you should be collecting if you're trying to capture this data. So I've listed a handful of data sources from attack. These probably seem super broad in nature, and that's intentional. They're meant to be a starting place where specific instances and what you specifically might collect within each of these is going to really depend on what tooling and systems are in your environment. But let's say you do collect these types of things. So how would you go about detecting these behaviors? So I would imagine most people are familiar with David Bianco's pyramid of pain, with behaviors being up at the tippy top. So I kind of want to just like focus on that for just a second. That first bullet that I've listed is a behavior-based detection. And so we can kind of capture this with process integrity levels. Essentially, if a process starts and then a child process with a higher integrity level than the parent is found, then that's probably an indication of privilege escalation. And so then the later bullets are showing artifacts of that behavior. So kind of the first are some API calls, which can be used to hunt for impersonated or duplicated tokens for our access token manipulation. While the other ones, like registry modification, again, that's kind of an artifact of the behavior. So some UAC bypass methods rely on modifying the registry first. For example, EVENTVWR adds a specific registry key before then performing the bypass. So if you kind of could link detecting on the executable running and a modification to that specific key, that's probably going to be a high fidelity alert for your environment. So since both the techniques we're focusing on for Windows are living off the land techniques, there are a lot of ways to perform the techniques. There's also a lot of ways to detect those. It's kind of a tricky one to capture every single use case, but I'll hand it over to Cathy to show us some real world examples.
So yeah, we've seen UAC bypass fairly frequently alongside DryDex infections. And Sarah mentioned looking at parent-child relationships. And one high fidelity detector for us has been FODHELPER and EVENTVWR spawning child processes, because they don't normally spawn child processes and they're usually being run under an administrator account. And on average, we're looking at processing around 30 terabytes of data, endpoint data a day. And in the last year, we've seen only 37 times have we caught EVENTVWR spawning a child, and 100% of the time that's been malicious activity. You can go ahead and switch the slide. And in the last year, we've seen 292 instances of FODHELPER spawning a child, and that's also almost 100% of the time that was malicious activity. The data in this slide is about a week old, and just in the last week, we've had more of these. So just to recap, neither FODHELPER or EVENTVWR normally spawn children. They're normally running under an administrator account. And so those are really good indicators for threat hunting and detection in your environment for UAC bypass.
And Cathy, it sounds like each of those things you just listed are primarily behaviors. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, it's process chaining, process relationships, yes.
So one of the things that Sarah pointed out is the hardest thing to pin down just in general when you're trying to detect malicious behavior has turned out to be one of the most high fidelity indicators that we've used to catch us in the wild, which I think is pretty cool. So that's a bit of a background of how to look for privilege escalation on Windows. Now we're going to transition over to Mac, and Erika is going to tell us a bit about her experience tracking down privilege escalation on macOS.
Thanks. Yeah, so with macOS, it's a little bit different than in the Windows side of things. One thing that Sarah mentioned was the use of basically living off the land techniques. And you're going to see that a lot more with macOS and in the Linux world, as Cathy's going to talk about later. Basically because you have such, in the Unix-based environment, you have such a rich set of tools that are very powerful, that are built into the system itself. So, but with macOS also, most of the techniques actually require user interaction. So most of these things that are used that you're going to see in the wild are actually requires the user to put in their password. So at most, the problem is that most of the prompts for escalation. Say your Outlook wants to install a new helper tool or something like that. All of these authorization prompts pretty much look the same, and attackers can make them look however they want. So they could make, it's very easy to make a dialog box that looks like legitimate Slack notification or legitimate Outlook notification or something like that. This is really going to be most of what we see in the wild. There are exploits that exist, but they're not often used. Actually, Phil Stokes just wrote a blog series on macOS privilege escalation that we can share the link after. If you're more interested in the actual exploit side of things, definitely recommend taking a look at that. But the reason that attackers don't often use this is that they're very OS really specific. They get patched very quickly. And why is an attacker going to go through the work to generate one of these exploits that may not even be successful, has a very small success rate, when most users are running as admin users, and most of the time they're going to just enter their password in. So it's much easier for the attackers to not have to go through specific exploit chains that may not work. Shlayer is one of the common examples that we've seen a lot of the last 2 years. And it uses a deprecated API called authorization execute with privileges, which will generate a password prompt. And so when we were looking into this, I was looking into this with my coworker, Jimmy, who was doing some MITRE work at the time. And we realized that there wasn't really an attack ID for this particular technique. So we submitted that back in February, and it actually has a threat ID of 1514 now for attack framework, and it's called elevated execution with prompt. So this will basically just indicate any of these privilege escalation techniques that prompt the user with one of these dialog boxes. And we're thinking that the success of this may be more prevalent with Catalina. It may actually be more successful because they've put additional security measures in place, which is great. But this means that there are going to be more, each application actually has to get specific authorization for things like using the microphone or using the webcam. And so the user is going to get more prompts more frequently from their applications. So what this leads to is that the user gets so used to putting their password in for everything that they start not caring or not looking really into what is it asking, and do I really want it to authorize this application to do this? So it's very easy to masquerade as a different application, especially when you have things like Microsoft Outlook or Slack or Skype or things like this that most corporate users are going to have running on their system constantly, during the workday. So this makes it very easy for an attacker to kind of slide an authorization prompt in there. The other one that I've just talked about very briefly is set UID and set GID. Cathy is actually going to talk a little bit more about UID about these because it is on the Linux side as well. But with the example of Shlayer in particular, this authorization execute with privileges will actually end up invoking the system tool security auth trampoline, which in the background ends up invoking UID, which is really just a set wrapper script for set UID. So that's just one example of this common technique that's between macOS and Linux. So I wanted to talk.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It seems like Apple, as they tighten their security, they're putting more of the security bearer becomes the user, as you're describing. Like more of that responsibility is being transferred to the user as the security of the system is tightened. But the way they're doing that is transferring it to the user.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of that's a good point. It's kind of a little bit mix of both, because they are actually doing a lot of things behind the scenes with things like Gatekeeper and XProtect, where they're actually scanning now for malware. There is some kind of AV capability now with the more recent versions of macOS. But in trying to lock things down, like you said, the user is going to have to take some responsibility for what they want running on their system. So a good example is when you let's say you download an application from the internet, gatekeeper, when you try to run that, depending on how you have your security system or security settings set up, it's going to tell you, hey, you downloaded this from the internet. It's from a developer that's not known. Are you sure you want to run it? And so the decision is up to the user at that point. But you do just have that extra step where it's not going to let it go just automatically. So, you know, it's a kind of a trade-off there, I guess. But let's talk about what we can actually collect on the system for macOS.
I do have one more question.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Kind of on this. If you had to guess just from your own research, do you think this is a technique that we're going to see in the wild for a long time?
Yeah, I think this is going to continue to be used by attackers because it is just so successful and so easy. It's really very, very easy to create a dialog box that looks fully legitimate. You can put, let's say, Flash Player, for example. Anybody can easily get the Flash Player icon, put that onto an installer window, and it looks like legitimate Flash Player update. But again, if you try to run it, the system is going to tell you, this is not from Adobe, this is not from a known developer. You know, you downloaded this from the internet. Are you sure you want to run it? The other thing with Shlayer, in the past, previously up until I think it was 10.14.5 back in Mojave, Apple actually, it used to be pretty easy to get a developer ID. You basically paid $99 and anybody could get one. So with Shlayer, for example, and with a lot of the adware, the attackers will register these developer ID accounts so that they can actually sign their binaries, and so they'll get past that gatekeeper step that we were talking about. That first authorization isn't going to go through, and they still have to authorize to give their password to give it access, but you're not going to get that first warning that says, hey, this isn't signed, or this, you know, I don't know this developer ID kind of thing. They have made that a lot harder as of Mojave and forward. There's a two-factor required to make they've made it a little bit harder to make those development accounts, and they've been revoking them much more quickly. So
yeah, another change they've made is that it used to be that once it was allowed, they never checked it again, and now there's periodic reviews in Catalina.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point too.
So we have one question that's come in from the audience on this. And just as a reminder, if anyone who's watching has any questions that come up during the course of the webinar, please throw them into the Q&A box on Zoom and we'll try to get to them as we go. But one question that's come in from the audience is, Erika, you've mentioned that living off the land is particularly common on macOS. Why would it be more common to see someone living off the land in macOS versus Windows or another operating system?
So on macOS and Linux, you have a larger set of tools, command line tools especially, that are very powerful. With macOS in particular, which I believe they're actually changing sometime in Catalina. I don't think it's been done yet, but it used to be that macOS was pre-installed with Python, Perl, other scripting languages. You have Bash, you've got shell scripts that you can use. You have all of these system utilities that if the user is admin, which most users are set up that way, they can do pretty much anything with those tools that they want to in the background and not necessarily involving installing something through the GUI. There are a lot of attacks that we've seen, and I'll mention one in a few slides, that uses this scripting, AppleScript or OSAScript, in order to do these things in the background. And once again, if they try to elevate privileges, that is going to pop up. But again, you can kind of masquerade that, and it's not necessarily going to trigger the user to think that something is doing something malicious, basically. Hopefully that answers the question.
It definitely sounds like there's a bit of like password acceptance fatigue.
Right, exactly.
On Mac as we're looking at this.
Especially when you can make them look legitimate. It's very easy to make them look legitimate.
So you're saying it could look like it's another application?
Yeah, so you can create a password prompt that says, this is Slack. Maybe if you have the Slack ID, or not ID, but icon. So the problem with this is that the attacker has to guess at what's running on that system, right? I mean, if they're going to try to pass something through where the user hasn't actually mounted the DMG or like going through an actual installer, if they're trying to do something from the command line, let's say, without the user, without putting anything up on the screen, they need to figure out, well, what program do I want to make this actually look like? And like I said, you can pretty much guarantee that most corporate users are going to have something like Outlook running, or maybe Word, or some common programs like that. So unless the attacker knows exactly what's running on the system, which a lot of times they will run scripts to get some system information before they launch the attack, which there's certain system information that you don't need to have root access in order to get that. So they can do a little bit of reconnaissance on it, find out what's running on the system, maybe what users there are, get a little bit more information, make more of an educated guess on how they want to present the password prompt to the user.
So if I'm not running Outlook and I get a pop-up that says Outlook wants my permissions, that could be a really bad sign.
Right, yeah. So if you're not running Slack, or maybe you don't even have Slack installed, and you get a prompt saying Slack wants your permissions, it's, you know, not going to be something that's legitimate.
I think that was a really good introduction to kind of the current landscape on Mac of privilege escalation. So why don't we move forward with what sort of data we should be collecting?
Yeah, so system artifacts, a lot of what you're going to want to look at is the configuration settings andplists. Your typical malicious program is going to have to establish some sort of persistence so that when you reboot, it's going to start up automatically. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but usually it's going to be in the startup items. There's going to be a launch daemon or a launch agent. And so there's a system utility called log, that's literally the name of the tool, that will collect and filter all of these events. And it's very powerful, but it's also very verbose. So you need to know what you're looking for, or if you're collecting all of it, you really need to be able to zero in on what exactly you're looking for. So some of the things, like with talking about configuration settings, one example would be changes in SIP status. So SIP is the system integrity protection that was put in sometime a few releases back. I don't remember exactly when, but basically it will prevent a lot of things from some of these things that we've been talking about from being able to run by default. And you can actually check this. There's a utility called CSR util that'll tell you the status of SIP. So the user is able to disable this, but it can't be done in the actual GUI. It has to be done in recovery mode. So there's the good news about that is that the attacker or even the user, if they want to disable SIP, they actually have to have physical access to the machine. So that's a good thing. The bad thing is that because it's done in recovery mode, you're not going to have logging of that event actually occur. So that's not going to be in your logs. However, if you're checking after the fact or doing periodically checking the status of SIP, that will be in, you can detect whether it's changed, but you're going to have to detect that change, not necessarily detect the event of it being changed, if that makes sense. The other one is AMFI, which has to do with file integrity and code signing. So this is one of the things I was talking about with the developer IDs. The AMFI will actually, it puts in what part of that check for making sure, okay, this is signed. It's signed by a valid developer, and that signature or certificate hasn't been revoked, or the developer ID hasn't been revoked. So some of those types of things are data you would want to collect and key in on. But we also want to talk about, like, how do we actually detect that? So the best method of detection is actually going to be behavioral. Unfortunately, when you want to try to detect privilege escalation on Mac, you can't really just detect privilege escalation itself, because you're going to get a lot of false positives. Every legitimate application that requires access, that event of the escalation is going to look the same for a legitimate program versus a malicious program. The event itself of the authentication is going to look exactly the same. If you looked through your logs, or if you've got EDR or something like that, and you look for something like security auth trampoline, we played around a lot with this when we were looking at Shlayer. Look at, is there something that we can key in on this particular, the way that this privilege escalation takes place for something specifically like Shlayer or another malicious program. And unfortunately, it pretty much looks the same for a regular application in most cases. So what you want to look at is, we actually have to look at the events that lead up to the authentication event and the events that happen after. So something like the download and execution from a script, and I'll give some examples of this. You're going to have, if you have something like curl or other of these system utilities that may be common and commonly used on a system, especially in a development environment or your IT management, a lot of things are going to be automated. But the specific command line options that are used and the succession of events that script does before authentication is going to give you an idea of whether that's something that's typical in your environment or something that's doing something malicious. This would be similar in the Windows world to something like PowerShell, when they're usually, it's pretty clear if a PowerShell command is doing something legitimate or malicious most of the time, just by looking at the command line arguments. And so on the Mac side and Linux side, you're going to have the same thing. It may not even be the tool that's used, but it might be the command line arguments that are used in conjunction with that tool. So another one that's very, very common is fake Adobe Flash Player installers. So sometimes you'll get these from a drive-by download. Most of the time though, you might be on a legitimate site, but there's an ad that either you click or there's a redirect somehow. And you think your legitimate site may have had its domain hijacked. And so when you go to the site that you're expecting to be legitimate, you get redirected to something. And say you were trying to look at a video or some sort of how-to something or other, and it tells you, you can't do this, you need to update your Flash player. So people will download these Adobe Flash Player installers thinking that they need this to view the content that they want to view. But in actuality, it's a hijacked Flash player. And this is, again, another case where the user is expecting to have to authenticate this. So the Flash player, the installer looks like every other installer, asks for my permission, and as far as they know, they've just installed something legitimate. But that's one thing that should be said. One of the most important things with Mac especially, but it is true for Linux and Windows, you really never should have to install Flash Player ever. And if you do have to for some reason, which Flash Player is not even supported by Adobe anymore, so there really shouldn't be any reason to install it. But if you do, you really need to go to the actual Adobe website and download it and verify that that's actually signed by Adobe and it's the legitimate copy of it. A lot of times there'd be a hash or something that you can verify to make sure that it's actually the real thing. So the last one is just execution from temporary directories. We see this a lot, especially even with the Flash Player installers. Instead of doing the initial execution from some sort of other system directory or a user directory or something like that, it'll install a lot of times, or the scripts, especially with scripts, it's going to execute out of like /temp, because the attacker knows that any user on the system, whether they're an admin or not, is going to have read-write access to that temporary directory. So a lot of times it is prone to false positives. So you do need to be able to narrow that down a little bit. But any execution from a temporary directory, that leading up to an authentication event, is definitely going to be suspicious.
So I'm going to jump in right here, Erika. We actually have a question from the audience on this one. Okay. We've been asked, why do adversaries often execute their tools from temporary locations? So can you tell us a little bit more about what temp directories are designed for and then how they might be abused?
Yeah, so temporary directories, especially on Mac and Linux, you can think of it as kind of a scratch space. So a lot of times, if in a legitimate setting, let's say there's something that needs to be done. Let's say you've got an IT management script that's going to do backups or something like that. You might need a scratch space to write some data to temporarily and then get it back later. But the reason that this would be abused is because it's kind of like, let's see, in the Windows world, there are some directories, Sarah could tell me off the top of my head, but you see it a lot in the Windows world too. It's a different set of directories, but there are certain directories that on any system, by default, any user is going to have access to read and write to it. And so that makes it a safe space, because you can't necessarily guarantee, they may not be able to find out what the username is, let's say. So writing to the user's directory isn't always a safe bet. But you know that on every Mac system is going to have a /temp directory, and unless somebody has locked it down for some reason, which I've never seen personally, the attacker can guarantee that they're going to be able to write something to that and execute it from there because of the permissions, the default permissions on it.
Sarah, can you tell us a little bit more of what that might look like on Windows?
Yeah, I mean, I think Erika hit it pretty well though, but like on Windows, yeah, you have like app data local, there's a bunch, yeah, I mean, they're all gonna be in C Windows, but Erika hit it with like, they almost always have writable access. So that's the key for temp directories, is being able to write whatever, like me as the adversary wants to then execute. That's where I'm gonna do it.
Right, yeah, read, write, and execute is important, because there are some directories that you can read and write to as any user, but you're not necessarily going to have execution privileges from that directory.
So this is almost like we're surfacing another behavior that would be consistent across different operating systems, but it looks a little bit different in the execution. Right,
your paths are going to be a little bit different, but the overall technique is pretty much the same, the idea of it. So I can give some examples of this as well. We kind of touched on it a little bit before, if you wanted to change the slide, Julie. Yeah, so when I talked about Shlayer, here's a good example of, this was a very high fidelity detection technique that we found. Each of these utilities, curl, OpenSSL, Base64, XXD, which is, if you're not familiar, is a command line hex editor. All of these utilities on their own would be something that would be common, again, like in a developer environment or IT management, where you're automating some things, automating backups, automating updates, things like that. But curl in particular, we found that these particular command line arguments, the -F0L, was a very, just curl with those command line arguments was a very high fidelity for Shlayer. We literally only found one case and we've had, over the past year, thousands of infections. There was one case of a particular antivirus product where they used this particular curl command to download an update. Not sure why, but other than that, it was 100% Shlayer activity. So the command line arguments in this case are a little bit unusual, because F is fail silently. So if there's an error, it's just going to fail silently. Most of the time, if there's a failure, you're going to want to log that error or look into it if you're doing something legitimate, right? And then 0 is it's forcing to use HTTP 1.0. So no HTTPS, no, whatever the default is going to be overridden with this command. And then L is follow redirects. And so that's another one where it's not something that you're typically going to use legitimately. And in the case of Shlayer, they use it because it relies on redirects to get to the second stage download, basically, the way that they've done that. But curl also, in conjunction with OpenSSL, so Shlayer would download something and then actually decrypt, decode, and then do some other manipulation to a final script. It's a series of scripts that finally downloads the last payload, which is the malicious final payload. So looking at some of these, the chain of these behaviors is actually going to be a high fidelity indicator for something like Shlayer. And then Crescent Core is one that was recent a few months ago, using OSA script. So a lot of times you'll see OSA script or Apple script, which this is going to be more of if instead of something like Shlayer, where you're actually, the user is mounting a DMG and running an installer from the GUI, this is something that's going to happen in the background. So somehow this script gets downloaded and executed from the command line. And this OSA script has a particular command line argument called that you put at the end with administrative privileges. So this tells OSA script that I want to run it with sudo or elevate privileges. And once again, this is going to prompt the user, but it's they can make it look like whatever they want to. So anything in that OSA script, I didn't give an example of an actual one, but you could put any sort of shell script or Apple script or OSA script formatted script in there. So if you think about, if you're more familiar with PowerShell, any of that scripting activity you can put into this, and then they just have to tack on with administrative privileges at the end, and that'll trigger the prompt for the user. And I think Cathy is going to give an actual, actually there was one more, I didn't put it on the slide, but it was just recently in the last week or two. The Lazarus Group, which is an actor group, malicious actor group, they actually have a new implant that's able to do in-memory download and execution of additional software. So it's not even doing something on the command line. And that's typically, it's not going to be logged. And once again, the privilege escalation technique itself isn't unique, but once it gets that permission from the user, it's going to probably fly under the radar for the most part because it's running in memory. So unless you have visibility into that with your EDR product or your whatever, it's going to be able to download and execute anything it wants to with root privileges once it gets that first escalation. So if you wanted to talk about the real world example there, Cathy, I can pass it off to you unless anybody has questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, that a lot of times on all the operating systems, you don't actually see the privilege escalation. You're more likely to detect on the activity that happens after the privilege escalation occurred. This is data from the last month from our customers, and again, detecting on the curl with the specific command line options Erika was just talking about, F0L. And in the last month or so, we've seen it 16 times, and all of those have been malicious. We don't, not occasionally, we also see Shlayer when we don't ever detect on this process, and likely something else on that system is blocking curl from running, but it's a really good detector. It's a high fidelity detector, as Erika said, for Shlayer. So now we're going to move on to Linux. And although there are plenty of opportunities for privilege escalation on Linux, it has a different threat model than what we've been discussing up to this point. As Erika mentioned, there's a lot of overlap in vulnerabilities between Mac and Linux, since they're both mixed-based systems. But Macs are usually user devices, so they're being run with for users and have user interaction, whereas Linux is often on servers. So Linux usually has fewer user applications, and they're less susceptible to the most vulnerable layer of security, which is users, and who are clicking links and downloading and installing unapproved applications and providing their credentials to authorization prompts. Normally, an attacker is going to try to obtain shell access when in order to get privilege escalation on Linux. So they're going to try to get shell access via either remotely or physical access if you have someone in your environment, but hopefully not. Once they have that shell access, they are going to look for vulnerable processes or a vulnerable process that they can launch and exploit vulnerabilities in that to escalate their privileges. One way to do that is via misconfigured set UID and set GID binaries. And Erika mentioned that in this same the same problem in relationship to macOS. Basically, if a set UID bit is on for a binary, it means that that binary runs with the privileges of the owner of that binary and not with the user who's launching the binary, responding to process. And there have one thing that's been publicized recently is a CVE that was released with specific command line options that allowed someone who had restricted access to sudo access to use sudo for any command. And basically, it's in older versions of sudo. The user would be listed in the sudoers file with permissions to run specific binaries as root. But if they ran sudo with this option shown on the slide here, -u #-1 or the other one, they would be able to run whatever command they were running with an effective user ID of -1. And so I'll show you in a real world example of that, of data that we've seen around that. That's a very good indicator just because it's so specific, but that's kind of rare for these. Another way that set UIDs are sometimes exploited is via misconfigured set UID binaries. An admin maybe doesn't care if less is run as root. They don't understand that it is a problem because shell commands and can be run directly from less, or a shell can be spawned from less. And if less is running as root, then those commands or that shell that spawned from less will be running with those same privileges. And the command line here at the bottom of the slide can be used to find all the set UID bit binaries in on a system. Let's see. So what kind of things are? Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. Please.
Oh no, I was just going to say. I think that was a really good point. Let's say that less, for example, which is a very common system utility, if this is misconfigured, this goes into what we've both been talking about. Sarah talked about it earlier as well, this chain of events. And if you're seeing something like less spawning another process that you're not expecting, less is not generally going to have child processes off of it. It's, so if less is running or something like that is running as root and you see child processes off of it that are suspicious, then that's definitely, a good indicator to key in on.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good point. So collecting, on Linux, you want to collect network traffic and net flow, authentication logs, and process monitoring via event logs, or you could also use OS query or audit-d. And then how you're going to detect the malicious activity within that data that you're collecting. You want to look at command line arguments, and usually one command line argument or one specific command line isn't going to give you a good detection rate. It's going to generate a lot of false positives because a lot of command lines that may be malicious can also look like the same activity that an admin would be doing on the system. So you'll normally want to look at process chaining. You'll want to try to correlate your network traffic with other activity that you're seeing on the endpoint that may look like enumeration or privilege escalation attempts or exfiltration of data. And as far as kernel exploits, that's nearly impossible to detect via EDR. The only thing I know about is techniques that similar to what Ksplice uses to monitor for changes to the kernel. So do either of you guys, do you have any other thoughts on these?
Yeah, sorry, I kind of took about the less spawning shell Python, but it's a really good point that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Something funny that kind of
the gun on that.
Something that comes to mind is that there's such a thin line between a sysadmin doing their job and an unauthorized user doing something they shouldn't, that it can be really hard to figure out which is which. One of our coworkers, Phil, always says that attackers are just unauthorized admins. And I think that's that's something that we're running into a bit here.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's shift into an example, Cathy.
Yeah, this is an example from data with the, it shows what an awesome indicator the sudo with the specific command line option of one of those two specific command line options is. We actually only saw this 5 times, and it was within a week or two after the CVE was published. They were all run on Macs, which is not, as far as I know, vulnerable to this technique, but it was basically people testing. It is a high fidelity indicator, but you're not likely to see it. And it's since been patched in subsequent version of sudo. I think it was released at the same time the CVE was published. So
just
back to you, Julie.
Messing around. Users
Yeah,
messing around with
exactly.
their fancy new toys.
Yeah, see, will this work here? No.
Mm-hmm.
I think
I'm sure
that
many of our audience that's in InfoSec probably runs into a similar thing.
They were probably the ones who did it.
I think that brings up a good point though too. Even though a lot of these things are patched, and we're going to have an example here in a second also, especially with Linux systems, and you've got, you know, a lot of times it's going to be servers or something, and so taking the downtime to patch things, a lot of times there's a long lead time before after a patch is released to when an enterprise is actually going to be able to implement it across the organization, because you have to do so much testing, and depending on the sensitivity of the systems, those things might not get patched for 6 months or a year. And this goes for the Windows side, Mac side as well, because we still see Windows systems that are vulnerable to Eternal Blue, which was patched over 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, that's a really good point. And it doesn't hurt if you can set up an alert on this command line. If it ever hits, then either it was somebody messing around or it's malicious. So it definitely, that's an easy thing to add. You're not going to be getting a ton of false positives from it.
It sounds like one of the reasons why it can take a long time for an enterprise environment to get all of their patching up to date is because a lot of people in positions of influence just don't understand why this sort of thing should matter on, you know, on an enterprise scale. So I think this is a really good time to talk about, you know, what's it to me if privilege escalation happens in my environment, and why should it matter? So I'm going to have Erika give a bit of a deep dive on this one. I'm really excited about.
Actually, I think Sarah's going to start us off, give us kind of the business implication overview, and I'll give some examples.
Yeah, sounds good. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about, you know, the behavior of detecting kind of privilege escalation, but I almost want to bring us back to the behavior of like why an adversary is going to do privilege escalation. If their goal is just to grab a bunch of documents off your system, they might not need to do this, right? You could do kind of a smash and grab campaign, just get on a box, collect everything you can, get off, call it a day. So if you're seeing privilege escalation on your system, that's probably going to be more indicative of other adversary goals happening, right? Mentioned in the beginning, kind of credential access, lateral movement, things like that. So because of that, you know, that means like that there's a pretty big business implication. So for example, like if an attacker gets access to, their first box, right? At that point, your remediation is remediating one box. Okay, not too bad. But let's say they do one of the techniques that we've been talking about today, and then they're able to do credential dumping and now maybe have domain creds. Well, now they can get on almost any box that they want to, right, within your domain. So now our problem just exponentially grew. We went from one box to hundreds, maybe thousands of boxes, right? Being a little exaggerative, but you get the point. So from like a business perspective, right, we just went from remediating one box to hundreds. And this can also mean, right, like they just went, maybe their goal wasn't just getting access everywhere. Maybe it was they are sure that you have, you know, top secret plans for some internal IP or PII or who knows what they're after. Well, by performing privilege escalation, now they have methods to go about to find that data, right, to find your crown jewels. So I think Erika has a good kind of real world implication of this happening.
Yes, one of my favorite examples was back a couple of years ago. There was a company called Maersk, that's one of the biggest shipping companies they're responsible for a major percentage of the world's shipping capacity. And they got hit with something called NotPetya, if anybody remembers that from the news. It was destructive malware that was actually targeting one thing, but it turned out that because it was using this privilege escalation vulnerability, it turned out that there were a lot of systems across the world that were open to this and open on the internet to it. And so the destruction just basically spread across the world. But Maersk in particular is one of my favorite examples, because if you're talking about financial risk, you're talking about there's a lot of implications to the business on this. They are a huge company. This is impacting literally everyone across the globe. When their systems were compromised with this privilege escalation technique, those attackers were able to get in initially, but then they were able to, as Sarah was talking about, spread rapidly across the organization because they were able to get onto one system, but then they used a tool called Mimikatz, which is able to dump any credentials from that particular system. And it turns out that some of these systems had admin accounts. There were multiple accounts that had never been removed by the admins. And so the attackers were able to take these and literally log into anything across the enterprise that it could touch. And so in a very, very short period of time, they had over 50,000 systems that were affected. It basically took down their entire organization. And they had a downtime of more than a week. So if you think about one of the world's major shipping companies being completely out of commission, the ships aren't going anywhere for over a week. And it was actually quite impressive that they were able to remediate this in 10 days, basically, because they had 50,000 systems, if you can imagine, that needed to be rebuilt. So, I mean, it was a major IT nightmare, basically, for them. The damages, the financial damages, have been estimated anywhere from, at the very lowest end, $300 million to billions of dollars. Some people, one article actually claimed $10 billion. I've seen it more in the $1 to $3 billion range, but that's a huge, huge cost to the company. And the funny thing is, the only reason that they were able to actually bring everything back up so quickly is that there happened to be a site in Ghana that had a power outage, and so they weren't hit with the attack. And so they were able to be offline, and they had the system to be able to, or the domain, they were able to rebuild from those systems that just happened to be offline at the time that this attack occurred, because it spread so quickly that there was no time for various sites to get the word and disconnect, basically. So I think that's a really good example. And we actually have, there's a link that talks about this particular example that'll be shared after the webinar as well. But the other example, because we've talked about Shlayer a couple times, I talked about this earlier, adware is one of the things that's very, very common, probably the most common threat on the Mac side. You see it on Windows too, not so much on Linux. But it often gets dismissed as, oh, this is just potentially unwanted program, or this is just kind of, maybe it gives pop-ups to the users or things like that. But the problem is that Shlayer and some of these other ones, once it gains root access, it can literally download and install anything that it wants to. It's already gotten past that gatekeeper, all those protections and things like that. Now, again, you're still going to have, if it tries to download and install something that is maybe not signed or something, there are some protections in place for that, but it already has root access. So it can pretty much do anything it wants to. And furthermore, because it has that access to that system, it has all of the information about that system. So if somebody is targeting, let's say, the CEO of a major corporation for some of the things that Sarah mentioned, the attackers that installed Shlayer or one of these other programs has all that information to pretty much determine that this is that CEO's machine. So they can sell that access on the black market or whatever, the dark web. They could send that to somebody that maybe it's a competitor, maybe it's somebody that wants to take down that company. Maybe, they want to use some ransomware on there to try to get a financial gain out of it. But basically, because it has this root access, it's kind of got the keys to the kingdom. So even though it's
sounds like
adware,
it could get really interesting really fast.
Yeah. So, it's something that can't be dismissed. Just because it's adware doesn't mean that it's not destructive or potentially destructive.
It can get a little crazy.
Yeah.
So we're gonna push forward a little bit here. I know we're reaching the top of the hour, and we probably have a number of people that have things to get to. We're gonna open it up for Q&A, but before we do, I just want to mention that we're going to be sending out a follow-up email to those that are going to be heading out. We're going to be including an article about that Maersk compromise that has a lot more detail that we don't have time to go into right now. And with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please throw them down in the Q&A on Zoom. And we're going to kick it off by a question that was brought up earlier from Jeffrey in the audience. Jeffrey says, making the end user the gatekeeper for security is a sure way to ensure that threat actors keep winning. Is there any hope for true process or application isolation or using containers to limit the potential damage that these things can do? Does anyone on the panel want to kind of kick off a discussion on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think his question maybe was directed on the Mac side a little bit, but I think he brings up a good point of that I kind of mentioned with like the Windows side, but it applies for the others as well, is that a lot of what we've talked about today is living off the land, which generally means too that like legitimate applications have to do these types of activities, you know, to function. So I think that's like why defense is so hard these days, is blending in with normal applications makes it much easier on the adversary side.
Yeah. And I think also to Sarah's point, we see this, you know, on the Windows side as well. The problem of, you know, developers of applications, you have to support, you know, legacy applications a lot of times. And there's this balance between allowing your programs to run, because obviously, you know, the user's not going to want to use the machine if they can't get their programs to run. So there's this balance between, you know, what do I block versus, you know, not making it impossible for application developers to actually get their applications to run on the systems. And they are adding, you know, Mac, especially with XProtect, they're trying to keep on top of some of these things so that it's literally more like AV, where it will block it before it even has to get into any of these things that fall on the user. So they're constantly adding these things, but it is that back and forth of, you still have to, the system still has to work.
Yeah, and it's not exactly what Jeffrey was talking about, or asking about, but some user controls, because a lot of the malicious adware or malicious, the malicious binaries come via ads on websites. Using an ad blocker could help, but you kind of need to be paying attention to what ad blocker you're using, because some of those can be bad too. But EFF Privacy Badger and uBlock Origin are two that I can think of. And then also, like Erika was emphasizing earlier, training and having controls to not allow your users to install Flash Player. Don't, if you get a pop-up, if your user gets a pop-up asking them to install Flash Player, they should never allow that, unless they are at Adobe site and they just clicked that they wanted to install Flash Player. That's the only case when they should be allowing that. But that's a user education problem, which isn't what Jeffrey was asking about, but unfortunately, that's still going to be part of the problem.
Yeah, we do always circle back to users are the weakest point of many security enterprise environments. So we have another question from Doug in the audience. Have you seen a trend towards actors utilizing more open source tools to gain initial entry into a network and then switching to more custom or proprietary tools once inside?
So I'd have to look into like what the trend analysis would be kind of for each like tactic as far as open source tooling versus custom. But I would say like in general, I think there's definitely an upward trend towards using open source when possible. Because I mean, it's already out there. You don't have, right? Like the dev side of it is super short and easy. But yeah, I'd be curious if anybody else has thoughts as like, you know, tactic level comparison for that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I can't give numbers or whatever on trends, but we have seen a lot more living off the land stuff, which is, you know, kind of the same, not exactly open source, but using things that are trusted and they're going to be probably whitelisted in the environment, other open source tools, things like that, especially on the Windows side, like you said, to gain access. And then, you know, they may have their own custom malware, custom things that they can install at that point. But using something that may fly under the radar to get into the system first is going to be less likely to be detected. So.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up everything that we have for you today. Thank you to everyone who jumped on to join us for this discussion. It's been very fun to go over some big picture stuff and some very tactical tips as well. So keep an eye out on your inbox. We'll be following up with some additional bonus content, including a link to an article about the Maersk compromise that we mentioned earlier. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to follow up with, please feel free to reach out to Red Canary or any of us online. We'd be happy to follow up. Thanks for coming out, and I hope everyone has a great day.